Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Edward Stringham, Professor of Economic Organizations and Innovations at Trinity College, and the author of Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bill. I appreciate it.
Ed, you come from a long line of economists and philosophers trying to convince us that politicians cause more problems than they solve, and that in many cases, people would be better off left to their own devices to work out their conflicts and cooperations. I asked you on the show because your book is packed with stories of the history of institutions that emerged through voluntary cooperation, some of which are still with us and some of which have been co-opted by governments. In the foreword to your book, Peter Bottke states that traditional political economists commit errors of both over-pessimism and over-optimism. What did he mean by that?
Well, he's describing a common view where people have this pessimistic view of human nature, and they say that if left to their own devices, people are going to cause problems. A corollary to that is markets are going to cause problems, and they can't do anything to solve it. In contrast, they, at the same time, are optimistic about government being able to solve problems. So the same people can't solve problems in step one can somehow solve the problems in step two. And he says there's a disconnect in this type of analysis.
Well, it's almost like magic takes place when there's an election.
Yeah, you step into the government official's office and then all of a sudden nothing can go wrong.
Well, rather than jump into analysis, take us back. Take us back to Amsterdam in 1614. What happened there that was so remarkable?
It was an amazing time. The dawn of the Dutch Golden Age. They created basically stock markets, large-scale stock markets. For the first time, people were trading all over the world between India with Amsterdam and all other countries. And this was done privately. And the interesting thing is government didn't understand the stock market. They saw markets having a bunch of transactions which were sophisticated, and they thought it was a form of gambling. So government said, we're not going to enforce all but the simplest contracts in this stock market. And even though it was illegal to engage in forward contracts and a lot of other contracts, stockbrokers did it anyway, and they made amazingly sophisticated contracts, short sales, options contracts.
In the 1600s?
Things that we think were invented in the 1970s were invented 400 years ago.
Without government having the power to arrest, prosecute, fine, and imprison crooks and cheaters, how did they enforce these contracts?
Well, it was done by two major things, and we can refer to that as reciprocity, the discipline of repeat dealings. When you're dealing with your friends every day, or you're dealing with the same business partners every day, you can't all of a sudden cheat and expect that they're going to continue to want to deal with you. In addition, they had reputation. So think about if you cheat in a business and now everybody else can find out, all of a sudden you're going to lose a lot of business in the future. And so they had very sophisticated yet informal mechanisms that took the place of law.
And they still had booms and busts. All of these mechanisms didn't make that go away.
Yeah, we can't hold markets up to the standard that there's never going to be changes in prices. So we hear these fanciful stories, a lot of them exaggerated, about tulip mania with prices getting to astronomical levels. A lot of it actually is documented to be fanciful and exaggerated. But still, they did have very sophisticated markets with all types of contracts, forward contracts that would take place months in advance. And they did all this even though it was not enforceable in courts of law.
And it powered a commercial empire that spread across the world and lasted for quite a while.
Yeah, so New Amsterdam, New York City, the first explorer was Henry Hudson, was financed by the Dutch East India Company. The city itself of New Amsterdam was founded by the Dutch West India Company as basically a for-profit venture. And one of my favorite books, Russell Shorto, argues that New York is as liberal economically and religiously tolerant compared to all other places because of its Dutch influence.
Now, these ideas spread. Voltaire once opined that if you go into the Exchange in London, you'll see representatives of all the nations assembled there for the profit of mankind. The Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal with one another as if they were of the same religion and reserve the name of infidel only for those who go bankrupt. Tell us about a private club called Jonathan's Coffee House.
So the second major stock market in the world was in London. The brokers there, too, weren't welcomed by government officials. They were kicked out of the Royal Exchange. So instead, they started trading in informal environments, especially in coffee houses. The main one was Jonathan's Coffee House, and they would start going there every day. Certain stockbrokers would even put out ads in the paper to say, if you'd like to have me buy or sell you shares, meet me at Jonathan's Coffee House. And they would get together there and do tremendous business. And in the same way, the government didn't enforce contracts in Amsterdam. They didn't enforce contracts in London. So they had to develop private mechanisms for ensuring contractual compliance. And so they started implementing a bunch of rules within this coffee house. They started transforming the coffee house into a private club that would create and enforce rules. And as a simple example, they would start putting down a defaulter's name on a chalkboard to say, don't deal with that person.
Shaming.
And they would label these people with all types of things, but the main one is if you defaulted, people would be called a lame duck and kicked out of the coffee house.
So it was almost like an Amish approach to shunning people who didn't follow the rules.
Yeah, so most people assume you need to incarcerate somebody or fine somebody using courts of law to ensure contractual performance. But in reality, in most cases, people find out peaceful ways of ensuring contractual performance.
The first time I came across this, I was a young engineer back in the 80s, and I worked with a lawyer who was a big gambler. He used to bet with bookies, $10,000, $20,000 at a time. And I asked him, how do they enforce the payments? So, because he'd pick up the phone, he'd just have a bet put down. Are you worried about getting your knees broken? And he looked at me and he goes, that would never happen. If I don't pay my bills, they'll cut me off. and that was the penalty.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the world, there's this theory called the prisoner's dilemma, which says two people would have an incentive to cooperate, but they're both going to cheat on each other. But in reality, most situations, people want to deal with one another for a long time.
Right.
We can think about this repeated interaction being so important to people. People don't want to be cut out of a business relationship.
Stock exchanges have gone on to become one of the most heavily regulated markets in the world. Has government oversight made them less prone to crashes, panics, and bad behavior?
Well, it's one of these ironies where you hear government officials time and time again pointing to the market and saying, look, it needs to be more regulated. If we just pass this set of regulations, we're going to solve all of these problems. And we can also see time and time again that they do not have the capability of solving the problems that they claim to be doing. So let's introduce the SEC. Let's introduce Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Let's introduce thousands and thousands of regulations. And even with this, they don't uncover some of the largest fraudulent schemes, such as with Madoff. And the problem is government regulators don't learn, and instead they're going to promise next time it'll be different. Let's introduce more regulations. And I'm quite sure the Dodd-Frank Act is going to do very little or nothing to prevent the next economic downturn. So that's, I think, the starting point that we need to take from our analysis. Unfortunately, we can't eliminate all problems. Madoff was a problem. But the question is, are government regulators going to eliminate that? And are there private solutions? And if we look actually with the hedge fund industry right now, there's a tremendous amount of third-party oversight, private third-party custodians and accounting services. Before Madoff, most funds used it. After Madoff, almost all hedge funds used it.
And we've grown this enormous, what they call shadow banking system that is pretty much outside the world of Dodd-Frank.
Yeah, so the government regulations in many cases are so onerous that people have to do business in all types of complicated ways just to avoid the bad banking regulations.
What makes the electorate so susceptible to the belief that a new regulation is going to pass that makes sure this will never happen again?
Well, easy solutions sound attractive to so many people, where somebody comes along and says, here I am to save the day. Well, if you believe that, then most people are going to support it. The problem with regulations and regulators, I would suggest is they're not this knight in shining armor. They're not this deus ex machina, this idea that the God can come down from heaven and solve all of our problems. In many cases, government regulators lack the knowledge or the incentive or the simple ability to solve our problems in a low-cost way.
Ed, Alexis de Tocqueville in his epic travelogue, Democracy in America, stated that voluntary organizations must be formed or civilization is in danger. What made America so exceptional when it came to creating voluntary citizens organizations?
The idea that individuals can get together and solve collective problems on a voluntary basis rather than relying on coercive government relationships, I think is one of the most important fabrics of society, especially American society, highlighted by Tocqueville. In Europe, there still today is a mindset when there's a problem that affects many people, one must turn to the government, this coercive authority which is going to say, you must do that, you must do this. Instead, we can rely on many things we can look at to see people getting together on a purely voluntary basis to form different groups like a club to say, hey, here's a problem, let's try and solve it privately rather than through the state.
Well, Europe never had Ben Franklin. How many private organizations did he start?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples throughout history of people just solving things either through not-for-profit groups or oftentimes for-profit groups, solving things that people assume must be solved by the government.
Ed, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1849, San Francisco became a raucous boom town. How did they manage in a state of near anarchy?
San Francisco is a great example of bottom-up order coming from citizens themselves rather than from the government. So it's basically a small village of just a few hundred people before the discovery of gold. After the discovery of gold, it was all of a sudden thousands, 10,000s of people coming into the city from all parts of the globe, from as far as China, from the Sandwich Islands, which is Hawaii, from the East Coast, from Europe. And at first, things were completely fine. They kind of figured out how to do things on a gentlemanly basis. But over time, not too long before, there was certain problems starting to develop. There were these people who would organize in groups, and eventually some of them became more surly when they couldn't find gold. And so there were these gangs that formed called the Regulators and the Hounds. Some of them were former convicts from Australia. And these criminals started threatening legitimate interest in San Francisco businesses. They also started threatening to kick out all of the Spanish-speaking people in San Francisco. They were called the Chilenos. And there was basically no real government at this time. Some observers point out that the city lacks even a jail. So rather than sitting around and doing nothing to solve the problem, merchants banded together and created a system where they would have private patrolling, private policing, and they would start going around and saying, hey, you guys, you regulators, you hounds, you Sydney ducks, these are the bad guys, you can't do this. You can't threaten the Chilenos. You can't break into bars and start smashing their property.
Did gunfights break out?
They had a lot of violence before these private committees were formed, and at least according to the history that I've been reading, and now history is written by the victors, they reduced the amount of violence significantly after they formed these private patrol groups. So you can read accounts of history in the 1850s of people saying, now we can finally rest peacefully at night because of the actions of these fine gentlemen. So here's one of the most basic public goods that people think about must be needed to be provided by government. Policing was provided privately by citizens themselves. And you can see lots of evidence of this throughout San Francisco history. You can see them written into the city charter. They still exist in limited numbers today. And at various times, people would call on these groups to deal with various problems of crime.
Let's go all the way to the other end of sophistication. How does the world of fine art auctions deal with forgers and fraudsters?
There's so many potential problems in this world, and most people, even if they assume government is there to help them, have to realize that certain things government is incapable of doing. And so with fine art, there's unfortunately a lot of fraudulent and fake art being circulated. Many government officials don't have the ability to identify this ahead of time. There's certain Chinese auction houses where certain people estimate that upwards of 80% of the art going through it is somehow forgeries or fraudulent. So that's a government-regulated market, and lots of fraud exists. In contrast, you can see certain auction houses in the United States. Obviously, the biggest ones are Sotheby's and Christie's, based out of London. And they do a very good job hiring different art historians and different people to check, to make sure, to try and ensure, rather, that what you're going to buy is actually legitimate. So you can think about these intermediaries, Christie's and Sotheby's, which also, by the way, were founded around the same time as in London, founded too in coffee houses. You can think about these intermediaries as putting a stamp of approval, of trust, onto a particular market. If you go through them, you might have to pay a small premium for this trust, but you know you're more likely to get what you're paying for compared to going through a market that is not privately regulated.
What's so important about the freedom of association and its corollary, the freedom of disassociation, when creating mechanisms for private governance?
When people have the ability to choose with whom they interact, they can choose to interact with people who have good reputations and say, if you want to be a member of this market, if you want to be a member, for example, of the stock exchange, you have to have demonstrated that you're a reliable person, or you have to have good recommendations to be let in. If you have the ability, in contrast, to exclude somebody who is shown to be unreliable, that means anybody who steps foot within the confines of the London Stock Exchange has this stamp of reliability coming with them. And the London Stock Exchange has adopted as their motto, "My word is my bond."
The ability to exclude people raises some other issues. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped rid the U.S. of the stain of Jim Crow, but what did it do to the freedom of association?
Well, the Jim Crow laws were a disaster because it prevented private businesses from serving people of different races. And so those laws were very problematic, and anything we can do to get rid of them is a good thing. On the other hand, there's been a lot of regulations which do mandate that certain people interact with other people against their will. And I think that there's a lot of things that private parties can do that are what I would say are immoral choices, choosing not to interact with certain people. In modern times, there's certain people who don't want to bake cakes for people having marriages that they don't condone. And even though as a business person, I wouldn't make those particular choices, and I think that people should be as open as possible, I do think it is a right of a bakery to choose whom to serve and choose whom not to serve. And when you force people to interact with customers against their will, then that can lead to certain problems. Now, the great thing about markets is you don't have societal-wide mandates of who gets to interact or who doesn't get to interact. So the problem with Jim Crow is it mandated society-wide who could interact with whom. Another modern example is modern immigration laws. It states for the entire continent, basically, of North America, who can travel where and who can't travel where. The great thing about private governance is it allows a plethora of choices. It allows certain people to interact with other people, rather than me having to convince the Canadian government or the Mexican government, can I interact with you? Can I move to your country? I can interact with 300 million different people. And each of these competing clubs or competing groups of people can come up with any sets of rules of who they want to include or who they don't want to include. And I think markets are much more inclusive. Even though it allows the ability to exclude, it's much more inclusive overall.
Attempts to regulate nationwide have led to a lot of dissatisfaction and polarization. Your book closes with the observation that although faith in government is still widespread, it may be passing its apex and declining. Why do you see this as optimistic rather than as a call to stock up on canned goods and ammunition?
The state has done a great job at convincing people that it's necessary. But I think there's been a lot of movement and a lot of people waking up in modern society saying, hey, maybe these politicians aren't as trustworthy as they say they are. So there's the classic set of survey questions of whom do you trust the least, the used car salesperson, the prostitute, or the politician? And the politician comes in first place in terms of the least trustworthy. And I think that's a good movement. People today trust Congress much less than they used to. I think that the Congress and other politicians have made so many false promises for so many years that there's also surveys where they say, how do you compare these people to cockroaches, to gonorrhea? And it turns out the politicians score above cockroaches but below gonorrhea.
And yet 90% of the time, people send their incumbent congressman back.
Well, there's certainly a lot of problems with the political system. And I think that the more people can recognize that these people are there because they're politically savvy rather than they're there to actually be solving problems of the world, that they can't do all of the things that they claim to do, the more that people can see that and realize that true solutions don't come through government. True solutions come through the private sector, through various mechanisms like reputation, reciprocity, informal rules, private formal rules. There's all types of ways that people do things to interact peacefully to help bring about cooperation privately rather than through government.
Ed, it was fun reading all the historical examples of exactly that in your book. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm so glad that you talked with me, Bill.
That was Edward Stringham, professor of economic organizations and innovations at Trinity College and the author of Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program now broadcast in 11 cities and online. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, sign up for updates on realclearradio.org, and if you'd like to help us bring more guests like this on the air, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.